Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. I want to talk to you today about an experience I had, and perhaps as a cautionary tale, what happened to the American academic avant-garde, or not academic avant-garde. I wouldn't call them avant-garde. The academic modernists, composers, most of whom were serialists, 12-tone guys, some of whom were, more out there, and many of whom were just writing music that was ugly and nasty, primarily, high levels of dissonance, an occasional tune thrown in for fun. Charles Warren, the late Charles Warren was a good example, the guy who wrote Brokeback Mountain and all of that stuff. And, they had their little followings, sometimes if they were lucky. And most of them now are totally forgotten. They are not played. They don't. I mean, some of them made lots of records. It's an interesting group, I think, of failures. And I mean, that's really what they were. They were failures. And there's no point in gilding the lily. Not that they weren't sincere, and not that some of them weren't talented, but they either lacked a personal voice or any kind of potential for audience appeal, or I don't know, 100 reasons why, but some of them got an enormous amount of play and attention. And one of them was Ezra Laderman, right? He's a household word. You remember Ezra Laderman? Yes, you have dozens of his recordings. There are a lot of CDs. A lot of his music was recorded. He had his own edition, his chamber works and a lot of other things. He was regularly performed, and nobody cared. And certainly nobody cares today. But I had the opportunity to attend the world premiere of his flute concerto with Jean-Pierre Rampal, no less. I forget what the orchestra was, actually. I was invited to go by a friend of mine, Pierre Bourdain, who used to be an executive at Sony. That's how, he was French, but that's how he knew Rampal, particularly. And he invited me to go because he had an extra ticket. And his regular girlfriend couldn't make it. So, I walked in. He was one of the owners of Orpheus Remarkable Recordings up on Lexington Avenue, along with Remy Farkas of Decca, who I've also talked about here. They were a pair, those guys. Pierre, unfortunately, passed away at a fairly young age of a heart attack. But he asked me if I was free and if I wanted to go. And I said, sure, I'll go. What the heck? And he said we could meet Rampal afterwards because he was, friendly from his days at Sony. And so we went. We went to the concert. And, we're waiting for the flute concerto to begin. And this enormous orchestra is sitting out there with like a full brass section and tons of percussion. And I just looked at Pierre and I said, watch the brass. They're going to play the whole concerto with mutes. Sure enough, as soon as it started, they stuffed their mutes. It was ridiculous. Actually, one of the first things you could tell about whether composers sort of know what they're doing is when they write a flute or a violin concerto, do they reduce the orchestra appropriately? What is the orchestration? Because these are instruments that are easily overpowered by the orchestra. I just did a review a couple of days ago of James Ennis doing Bernstein's Serenade. Bernstein evolved his own concerto orchestration that he used in the Serenade, in Hallel, in the 3 meditations from Mass for cello and orchestra. Whenever he had a concerto, he scored it for strings, percussion, and harp. That was his concerto ensemble, and it worked fabulously, absolutely marvelously well. It had all the color he needed, all the accompaniment he needed, all the contest between the solo and the orchestra, but he could do anything he wanted without covering the solo. It was just such a smart move. Well, Laderman didn't do it that way. So there's this huge orchestra out there, and all the brass are muted, of course. And Rampal played this thing, and it was just tedious beyond belief. It was just dreadful. And the central movement was designed as an elegy to the memory of, I believe it was Judith Blagan, the lovely American soprano. She's the soloist in the George Selmahler Fourth. Very, very fine singer. And it was actually a tune, a beautiful tune. And, Laderman had the wonderful idea in a concerto, like a flute concerto, of when recapitulating the tune without the melody, just having the accompaniment. I mean, it was, conceptually there were all kinds of issues. And I don't want to pretend to be smarter than Laderman because he wrote lots and lots of music and I haven't heard it all. But this was a bomb. Anyway, so we went backstage afterwards and to meet Ron Paul. And Laderman was there. And he had his groupies. And they were fawning all over him. I just remember this woman going, "Oh, Ezra, it was just sublime." And I was like, "Oh, save me." And I, was introduced to Ron Paul. And Ron Paul says to me, what did you think of it? And I just said, honnêtement, pas beaucoup, not very much. I was trying to do it in French because I thought maybe fewer people would hear if I whispered in French. Anyway, and he turns to me and says in French, "Entre nous, je ne l'aime pas." It's like, I don't like it. I don't like it either. But he played it. He played it beautifully. And that got me to thinking. Now, it's been a long, long time. This was about, God, 35, 38 years ago that this happened. And I haven't heard much of Ezra Laderman since. And so I wanted to look him up and just see, what happened to him. And I think his story is a very, very interesting one. Because here's a guy who pushed all the right buttons in his career, but he didn't write any music that anybody really cared for. Or he didn't have the right connections, or I don't know what. But let me just tell you now, biographically, what happened to him, because he's got a good, juicy article in Wikipedia, and his life actually was really rather interesting. He writes about, let's start with he went to the New York City's High School of Music and Art. He said, "At 4, I was improvising at the piano. At 7, I began to compose music, writing it down. I hardly knew it then, but I had at a very early age made a giant step to becoming a composer." It may have been his giantest step. Anyway, he served in the U.S. Army as a radio operator with the 69th Infantry Division during World War II. He writes of his time there. "We were in Caversham, England, posted to enter the war. It was here that I learned that my brother Jack had been shot down and killed in Germany. The Battle of the Bulge, crossing of the Rhine at Remagen, liberating Leipzig, meeting the Russians at Torgau on the bank of the Elbe were the points in this constellation that was filled with tension and waiting, victory and grief. We became aware of the horror and what we now call the Holocaust while freeing Leipzig." During the weeks after the war was over, Laderman composed his Leipzig Symphony. The work brought him recognition within the Army, and subsequently he was assigned as orchestrator of the GI Symphony Orchestra. Gee, I wonder what happened to that ensemble. Really interesting. Laderman was discharged from the Army on April 22, 1946. He studied composition under Stefan Volpe, one of the great dodecaphonicists of New York City, and Miriam Gideon at Brooklyn College, where he earned his BA in 1950. He then went on to study under Otto Luning at Columbia University, a major guy, where he earned his MA in 1952. Laderman's compositions range from solo instrumental and vocal works to large-scale choral and orchestral music. He has also written music to the Academy Award-winning films The Eleanor Roosevelt Story and Black Fox. So there is some, potential for something that may be a little more popular. Laderman has been commissioned 3 times by the Philadelphia Orchestra, twice by the National, Louisville, and Chicago Symphonies, as well as from the New York Philharmonic, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles Philharmonic, Dallas, Houston, Fort Worth, Syracuse, Denver, Columbus, Albany, and New Haven Symphony Orchestras. In 1971, he collaborated with Alfredo Antonini, musical director of the CBS Symphony Orchestra, during the television premiere of his opera And David Wept. In addition, he has written for such distinguished artists as Jean-Pierre Rampal, aha, see, I told you, Yo-Yo Ma, Emmanuel Axe, Cheryl Milnes, Aldo Parasot, Samuel Barron, David Schifrin, Ransom Wilson, Judith Raskin, Elmar Oliveira, Erica Monini, Nathaniel Rosen, Stephen Cates, Tony Appel, and Leonard Amer, among others. From 1971 to 1982, he was professor of music composition at the State University of New York, Binghamton, and senior composer in residence. In 1979, he became the director of the music program at the National Endowment for the Arts. In 1991, he was elected into the membership of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and in 2006, he was elected president for a 3-year term ending in 2009. At the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I mean, these are big, big positions. In 2004, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of music from the State University of New York at Binghamton. Through June 2014, Laderman taught music composition at Yale University School of Music. I knew he was there because I knew some of the people at Yale. A resident of Teaneck, New Jersey, Laderman was named as dean at the Yale School of Music in 1989 and served in that position to 1995. He died on 28 February 2015 at the age of 90. I mean, he got Guggenheim Fellowships. He got the Prix de Rome for the American Academy in Rome. Really an extraordinarily successful career in everything but as a composer with the public. And I read that with great wistfulness. I feel bad for him. I mean, you know, he was a really, really serious guy, and he wrote lots of music, none of which I enjoyed when I heard it, but you might. I don't know. He's out there. The stuff is out there. Some of it's still available. And I just wonder, do you know how many people there are just like him in American academia and in academia all over the world? I remember, you know, going to all these concerts and hearing these works by these people. I mean, there was Laderman, there was Leslie Bassett was another one, Donald Erb, and the absolutely egregious Robert Hall Lewis. Oh my God, it was just the worst. He was the, you know, the muse of Baltimore. I mean, the joke was all of his students had to go to his concerts or he'd flunk them. He taught at Goucher and some other places when I was at Johns Hopkins. You know, their music was really, really bad. Most of it that I heard. I mean, these, and they were all employed. I mean, basically employed by universities, by education institutions of higher learning, and they got commissioned. And we audiences, and I know a lot of you were around at the same time I was, sat through these things, and it was just outrageous. I mean, now sometimes there was something wonderful. I mean, Jacob Druckmann, who was like terrific. I mean, avant-garde and fun. George Crumb, of course. I mean, you know, the really interesting names are somehow the cream floats to the top. Somehow it does. But below the cream, there is a lot of sour milk, just tons of it out there. And it's really interesting to go back and think about some of these names and some of these people who really had major reputations and major recognition within a certain circle that nobody especially cares about, for their music that nobody especially cares about. It's both sad and real world, right? I mean, this is the survival of the fittest school of music that survives, right? I mean, some of it will make it, some of it won't. But there's a lot of sweat and tears and effort and energy going into creating a lot of really ugly music. And I just thought that it might be fun to revisit some of it. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.